Hi, students. I wanted to just say hi, introduce myself. Hi, I'm Erin Howard. I'll be working with you in HIS 152 this summer. As I mentioned on the content page, I'm a museum curator. I work with primary sources all the time, and I'm excited to share them with you because they are one of the most important building blocks to historical study. That's because they're the closest thing we have to going back to that original historical time period. And by learning to work with them and analyze them, you are able to build your own scholarly work off of those instead of just relying on things that other people have said. So I will help you with that by providing primary sources for you, one this week, and then after that, two a week. And also at different points in the semester, requiring you to find your own primary sources on different topics. Each week, I'll provide some short answer questions for you to answer to help you learn how to do analysis. And the first question is always, what are the ABCs? The ABCs are just my shorthand for some of the basics of primary source analysis, and I'll take you through those right now. The A stands for audience. The audience is the original intended audience of the source. Who did the creator make this for? It's um, Often students will get tripped up and they'll say, well, I'm learning a lot from this source, so it must be that it was made for people like me. We're the audience because it's great for students to work with it. That's not what this means, though. It's important to know who was this created for in its original context. So, for example, a diary is self-reflection. It's created for self. While a campaign speech from, say, a presidential candidate is going to be for voters. It's often going to be persuasive to try to get support for the election. A newspaper article will have a bias, maybe geographical, like the Chicago Tribune will have a bias, or I mean, an audience that is local, that people who live in the Chicago area. While a movie will be for the public of the time, it will be a very wide audience, but think a little deeper. It will be for an audience that has time for recreation and money for recreation. So that's the A. B is a little bit more complicated. B is for bias. We're used to thinking about bias as something that's very, very negative. You want to avoid having bias. You want to avoid finding sources that have bias. That's certainly true when you're looking at something like the news. You don't want opinion. You want a little bit more fact. For primary sources, we assume that everything has bias. When you're looking at your primary source, your default should be everything has bias. The way a picture is cropped is part of the bias. What is chosen to be published or covered in a newspaper article is part of the bias. The bias is any factors that influence the author or creator's point of view. Using a source that has bias, because we think all primary sources have bias, it's not a bad source to choose. It's just that you need to know where that source is coming from. Where is that creator coming from? So you have to be able to identify the bias. A good example, maybe to go through this, is Martin Luther King Jr., because he's not a negative figure. We all know that Martin Luther King Jr. was a hero of the civil rights movement. Did he have bias? I've had students want to say, well, no, because he's a positive figure for equality. Well, the fact that he is in favor of equality is part of his bias. Um, the That's not a negative thing, but there are going to be people who are pro segregation. He is not one of them. His bias is pro equality and integration. Another bias is that he trusts that the government will take a role, and that if it does, then um, that will be a blow to racism. He trusts the government. A lot of these marches and rallies were to change laws. He felt if the law was changed, then that would have a positive impact on society. That's part of the bias. He was also biased in favor of peaceful protest. There were other civil rights leaders who were not. So that is part of his bias. It's part of his point of view, and it's part of his context. So we should do this with every source that we look at. What is the bias? And the final one is cause. What caused this to be created? Why did the creator make it? Is it just to inform? Is it to change an opinion? What is it? So, for example, a letter will be simply to communicate. A diary might be for self expression. A campaign speech, as we said, is going to be to influence people. And then a movie might be to entertain or to make money. So, that's going to influence all of the others, both the audience and the bias. So, the C is cause. So, I look forward to seeing your take on the ABCs for our sources this semester.